when the axoplasm of the neuron is negatively charged, we call such a neuron to be in an excited state. Neurons are divided into three types. One is called as the multipolar neuron, the other one is bipolar, and one more is the unipolar neuron. If the axon is covered by a myelin sheath, it is called as myelinated. Hello everyone, a warm welcome to another session on chapter 21, that is Neural Control and Coordination. I am Dr. Divya, Biology Faculty, Vidhyaashram Pre-University College, Mysuru, Temple of Excellence. So in the previous session of this chapter, we had discussed about the nerve cell, that is the neuron, and the different parts of the neuron, and we also learnt about the different nervous system that is present in the humans, that is the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. In today's session, we shall discuss about the generation and conduction of the nerve impulses, that is how exactly the nerve impulses or messages are conducted. So to begin with, let us first start with studying the types of neurons. So we knew that the neuron is made up of axon, the dendrites and the cell body, three parts, right? So here, based on the number of axons and the dendrites, the nerve cells or the neurons are classified into three important types. So based on the number of axon and the dendrites, the neurons are divided into three types. One is called as the multipolar neuron, the other one is bipolar, and one more is the unipolar neuron. So multipolar neuron means they'll have one axon and two or more dendrites which are found, and they are usually such type of neurons are found in the cerebral cortex of the brain. So if you can see the image here, when talking about multipolar neuron, you can see the axon is, so the axon is just one. So this part is the axon. And talking about the dendrites are more than 2 to 3 in number. So this is a multipolar neuron which is usually found in the cerebral cortex of the brain. Next, talking about the bipolar neuron. So bipolar neuron also has one axon and only one dendrite, and such type of neurons or nerve cells are usually found in the retina of the eye. So they'll have one axon. So bipolar, if you can see, one axon, and they'll have one dendrite. So that is why they are called as multipolar neuron. Now talking about one more neuron, that is unipolar neuron. So unipolar neuron has cell body with one axon only, and it is usually found in the embryonic stage. That is, only in the embryo stage of an organism this is found. Later on, as the embryo matures into a fetus and an adult, this particular unipolar neuron is lost. So what happens in unipolar neuron? Only one axon is present with the cell body, but the cell body doesn't have any dendrite. So that therefore it is called as unipolar. So multipolar means one axon with many number of dendrites. Bipolar means one axon with one dendrite, and unipolar means only axon and no dendrite present. So these are the different neuron types. So here let's study about the types of axons now. So there are two types of axons. One is called as myelinated axon. So myelinated means it is covered by something. It is covered by a myelin sheath. If the axon is covered by a myelin sheath, it is called as myelinated. And the other one, on the other hand, if the axon is not covered by a myelin sheath, it is a non-myelinated axon. So the myelinated nerve fibers are covered with Schwann cells which form a myelin sheath around the axon, or in simpler terms, as I said, if they are covered by a myelin sheath, they are called as myelinated axon. And the gaps between two adjacent myelin sheaths are called as nodes of Ranvier. So if you can see here, This is the axon. The axon is covered by a myelin sheath, and in between the myelin sheath there are gaps that are present, and these gaps are called as the nodes of the Ranvier. And apart from that, these myelin sheaths are nothing but that is the nerve fibers are enveloped with Schwann cells, and these Schwann cells together they form a myelin sheath, and in between the myelin sheath there is a gap which is called as the node of the Ranvier. So the gap that is present, we call it as node of Ranvier. Next, talking about the non-myelinated axon. So the non-myelinated or unmyelinated axon or the unmyelinated nerve fiber is enclosed by Schwann cell, and Schwann cells are present, but only thing is they do not form a myelin sheath around the axon. And such type of non-myelinated or unmyelinated axons are usually found in the autonomous and the somatic neural system. We had studied, right, two types of neural system and the peripheral neural system, that is the autonomous and the somatic neural system. You can go back to the previous session of this chapter and have a look into it. So that is where they are found. That is the non-myelinated axon. So easy to remember. Myelinated axons means they have around the axons a presence of Schwann cells. These Schwann cells form the myelin sheath, and therefore they are called as myelinated axons, and in between the myelin sheath there is a gap that is present which is called as the nodes of the Ranvier. And myelinated fibers or myelinated axons are usually found in the spinal and the cranial nerves, that is the spinal cord, that is central nervous system. There is the myelinated axon present. Non-myelinated means they are the nerve fibers which have Schwann cells, but they don't form a myelin sheath around the axon, and such non-myelinated axons are usually found in the autonomous and the somatic neural system. So this was about the types of axons. Next, moving on to the generation and conduction of nerve impulse. How exactly a nerve impulse? So far we had studied in the previous session when talking about the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, that nerve impulses are created, right? Nerve impulses are carried from the tissue, that is via the efferent nerve, to the spinal cord, and from the spinal cord the efferent nerve carries the impulse to the particular organ. So that we had studied. So what are these impulses? How exactly are they conducted? So that we shall look into. So neurons, so what are neurons? Neurons are nothing but the functional unit of the nerve cells, right? So these neurons are excitable cells, and their membrane are in a polarized state. When I say they are in a polarized state means inside the neuron there is presence of, or inside the axon of the neuron, it is negatively charged. So when the axoplasm of the neuron is negatively charged, we call such a neuron to be in an excited state. So if you can see here, this is the axon of the neuron, because axon is the one that transmits the messages that is received by the dendrites. From the dendrites, the messages pass to the cell body. From the cell body, the messages pass to the axon, and from the axon, it will pass to the bulb-like structures that are present, that is the synaptic knobs. And from those synaptic knobs, in the synaptic knobs are present certain neurotransmitter chemicals which will send the signal to the respective targeted organ, right? So that is how it takes place. So axon is one such component of the, or one part of the neuron that actually helps in the transmission of the impulse, so conduction of the impulses. So here axons, or the nerve cell in particular, are always in a polarized state, means their cytoplasm or the axoplasm in particular is always negatively charged. So if it is negatively charged, it is said to be in a polarized state. And different types of ion channels are present on the neural membrane. You can see, right, different types of ion channels. There are positive charges, and sometimes in few regions, depending on the sodium and potassium ions, they can be negatively charged also in few of the places. And these ion channels are selectively permeable to different ions. So, on the neural membrane, there are a lot of ion channels which help in the transport of ions into the neurons or the nerve cells and out of the neurons or the nerve cells, and therefore, these ion channels, they are selectively permeable to only certain types of ions. So, this is about the general information about the nerve. So, now we understood the nerve cell is always in a polarized state, meaning inside the nerve cell it is always negatively charged and outside it is positively charged. So, moving further. Now, when a neuron is not conducting impulses, what it will do? So, when a neuron is not conducting any impulse, means when a neuron is in its resting stage, means no messages are passed, no signals are passed, right? So, when they are in the resting stage, the axon membrane is comparatively more permeable to potassium ions. I told you the neuron membrane, or in particular here the axon membrane, in which ion channels are present. So, ion channels will be present. So, these ion channels, they are selectively permeable to certain ions only. So, when an axon is in a resting state, they are selectively permeable only to potassium ions and somewhat permeable to sodium ions. Means they are more permeable to, they are selectively, they are more permeable to potassium ions, but somewhat permeable to the sodium ions. Similarly, the membrane is impermeable to negatively charged proteins present in the axoplasm. So, what did we understand? So, in the previous slide, we understood that though the axon is always in a polarized state, the axon is covered by a membrane. That membrane has many ion channels, and those ion channels are selectively permeable to only certain ions. Now, to what type of ions are they permeable when the axons or when the nerve cell are in a resting state or when they are not conducting any impulses? So, when they are in a resting state, the axon membrane is more permeable to potassium ions and somewhat permeable to sodium ions, but they are completely impermeable, or they do not allow the entry of the negatively charged proteins that are present in the axoplasm. So, this is how they are. So, next here, consequently, the axoplasm inside the axon contains high concentration of potassium. Why does it contain high concentration of potassium? Because the axon was in the resting state, and when the axon is in the resting state, the ion channels that are present on the axon membrane, they will allow the complete penetration of the potassium ions inside the axoplasm. Therefore, the axoplasm is filled with potassium ions. Don't get confused with this picture, because here I have the picture of an axon with an excited state. I'll tell you when it is in an excited state what might happen. And negatively charged proteins, but it is in low concentration of sodium. But sodium concentration is more where? Outside sodium concentration is more. Outside sodium concentration is more, inside potassium concentration is more when the axon is in a resting state. So, here in contrast, as I told you, the fluid outside the axon contains a low concentration of potassium and a high concentration of sodium. Why high concentration of sodium? Because none of the sodium ions, because the axon is in a resting state, the ions are not permeable to sodium or very less permeable to sodium. Therefore, only few sodium ions would have entered into the axoplasm. Remaining all the sodium ions will remain outside the axoplasm in the fluid. So, that is the reason why outside the concentration of sodium ions is very much high, and this forms a concentration gradient wherein inside the axoplasm the potassium concentration is more and outside the axoplasm the sodium concentration is more, and these ion gradient across the resting membrane are maintained by the active transport of ions by the sodium-potassium pump, which transports 3 sodium outwards for 2 potassium into the cell. Now, how does this exchange take place? Because it is permeable to some of the sodium, right? To very less sodium ions, it is permeable. So, what happens here is, as and when 3 sodium ion enters into the, or the 3 sodium ion moves outside of the axoplasm, 2 potassium ions will enter into the cell. So, this is what happens. So, 3 sodium will move out, 2 potassium ions will enter, and it will continue until the axoplasm becomes filled with potassium ions. This is when the axon is in the resting state. Now, when they are in the excited state, what happens is, when they are in the excited state, the sodium ions will enter in and the potassium ions will completely move out. So, that is what happens. So, that is how the concentration gradient is maintained. Moving further, as a result of 3 sodium ions moving outside and 2 potassium ions moving inside, the outer surface of the axon membrane, it will possess a positive charge, while the inner surface becomes negatively charged. Why inner surface becomes negatively charged? Because in the inner surface there is presence of the proteins. Because these ion channels are not permeable to proteins, negatively charged proteins, and therefore they are not letting the proteins out. But instead the sodium ions are moving out, the potassium ions are moving out, and all that concentration gradient is being maintained. Therefore, consequently, what happens? The inner surface of the axon, it becomes negatively charged. Therefore, the axons are always in a polarized state. So, what did I tell you in the few slides before? That axons are always in a polarized state, right? They are always negatively charged in the inside. The axoplasm is always negatively charged. So, the electric potential difference across the resting plasma membrane is called as the resting potential. So, this is what happens, and when they are in the excited state, it is the vice versa of this that happens. So, this is about the generation and conduction of the nerve impulses. Moving further, we shall study what happens when a stimulus is applied. So far we had studied what happens when the axon is in a resting condition. To make you understand, I had also put the picture of what happens when the axon is in an excited condition. So, when it is in an excited condition means some stimulus is being received. So, what happens in detail again we will study now. So, when it is in a resting condition, what did I tell you? When it is a resting condition, the axons are in a polarized state, meaning the inside of the axon is completely negatively charged and the outside of the axon, that is the fluid of the axon outside, is completely positively charged. So, when a stimulus is applied at a site on the polarized membrane, the membrane at the site A becomes freely permeable to sodium. When the axon was in the resting stage, was it permeable to sodium? No, right? It was permeable, but only to a very less extent. But instead it was permeable to potassium. Now it is becoming permeable to sodium. Why? Because a stimulus has been received by the axon, a signal has been received by the axon, and the axon has become excited now. So that is the reason. So this actually leads to rapid influx of sodium, means rapid entry of sodium into the axoplasm. Now, what is getting filled inside the axoplasm of the axon? Sodium. What is there inside the axoplasm of the axon when it is in the resting stage? Potassium. Later on, because of the concentration gradient, inside of the axon becomes negatively charged, that is, it will be in a polarized state. Now, I am talking when it is in an excited state. When it is in an excited state, what happens? Potassium ions will move out, sodium ions will start to enter into the axon, that is in the axoplasm. Now, sodium ions are filling, and it is followed by the reversal of polarity at the side, that is the outer surface of the membrane now becomes negatively charged and the inner side becomes positively charged. So, in a resting state, the axon, so you need to remember this, in a resting state, the axon is always polarized. That is, inside of the axon or the axoplasm is negatively charged and the outside of the axon is positively charged. When the axon is excited because of a stimulus or because of a signal or whatever, at that time, the inside of the axon becomes positively charged, that is the axoplasm becomes positively charged, and the outside of the axon becomes negatively charged. So the polarity of the membrane at the A site is thus reversed and hence it becomes depolarized. So polarized means inside is negative, outside is positive. Depolarized means inside is positive, outside is negative. So if you can see here, wherever depolarization occurred in the A side, the sodium ions are entering into this and the potassium ions are moving out. Therefore, inside it is becoming positively charged and outside it is becoming negatively charged. So this is what happens. So the electric potential difference across the plasma membrane at the site A, it is called the action potential. Now this region is the action potential because a stimulus is being generated, a signal is being generated there, and which in fact is termed as the nerve impulse. So in the stimulus generated in the action potential is nothing but the nerve impulse, wherein the axon becomes depolarized at certain sites. For example, the A site in this particular case. Can you see here remaining everywhere it is? Not everywhere. This is the entire axon. Here and all it is polarized. Here it is depolarized. But the nerve impulses will move like this. Till where will they move? Till they reach the synaptic knob. They have to move, right? And at that time, the entire everything will become plus plus and outside it will become minus minus like this. That is what happens until it reaches the synaptic knob. So that is what, this is nothing but the conduction of the nerve impulse. And at sites immediately ahead, that is what I said, at sites immediately ahead. Say for example, if this is site B, again the membrane, here it will become positive and here it will become negative. So that is what I have written here. So this is how the impulse gets generated. So I need not have to read the complete thing because I have already told you, as and when the impulses move, inside everywhere it will become positive charge, outside it will become negative charges like this. So B side, then it will move to the C side, then D side like that until it reaches the synaptic knob. So that is how the impulses are sent. Next it might reach another neuron. There it will transmit the impulse. Again there also the same process will continue. Until then that neuron will be in the resting state. Now I hope you got it. And once the synaptic knob passes the impulse to the next neuron, that will get excited and this process will occur. So that is how it happens until it reaches the particular organ to generate the message. So this is about generation and conduction of nerve impulse. It's quite interesting, right? So this is how the nerve impulses are generated from one neuron to the other. So this was about generation and nerve impulse. So this is how the sequence is repeated. Even this also I need not have to explain because I told you the sequence get repeated wherein the entire axon becomes stimulated, becomes depolarized, wherein inside it will become completely positive charge and outside it will become completely negative charge. That is depolarization. So that is how nerve impulse is conducted. So this was about this particular session wherein we dealt with the different types of neurons and the different types of axons that are present. So based on number of axons and the dendrites are present, the neurons are of three types: unipolar, bipolar and multipolar. And also we studied about the two types of axons based on whether they are covered by a myelin sheath or not. If they are covered by a myelin sheath, they are called as the myelinated axon, and if they are not, or myelinated nerve fiber, if they are not covered by a myelin sheath, they are called as non-myelinated or unmyelinated nerve fiber. And also we understood in detail how the axon behaves or how a neuron actually conducts impulses and what happens to a neuron when it is in a resting state. So when it is in a resting state, they are depolarized, wherein inside the axon it is negatively charged and outside it is positively charged. And when an impulse is conducted, at that time the axon becomes excited and therefore it becomes depolarized, wherein inside the axon it becomes positively charged and outside it becomes negatively charged. So that is how nerve impulses are conducted throughout the neuron cells. So this was about this session. So in this session we learned how the nerve impulses will travel through the axon and it will reach the synaptic knob. So now once it reaches the synaptic knob, how the impulse gets transmitted, that we shall study in the coming session. So we shall meet again in the coming session. Thank you.